Excellencies, esteemed forum participants, colleagues and friends, please welcome on stage Kevin Casas Zamora, Secretary General of International IDEA.
Hello, hello, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I'm very honored to be given the opportunity to moderate this panel on the rather small issue of how to mend, how to fix a fractured world. And there are many reasons why this question matters. Global governance, as we know, is under considerable stress due to a complex and interconnected set of factors which I understand were explored here yesterday at some length. They include, but they are not limited to, armed conflict in over 50 countries, increased competition between global powers, domestic interest taking precedence over international cooperation, economic inequality within and between countries, and a planet in crisis given the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And if you allow me, given that I do what I do, I should also say that democracy is in retreat globally. Transformational shifts are needed to deliver on current challenges and build peace and security. So in response to current and future problems, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a summit of the future to generate a new global consensus on multilateral solutions. In preparation for the summit, he appointed a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. Our panel today will reflect on the outcome of this work and how our global governance system needs to change to deliver on peace and sustainable development, and how to bring such change about. And we are fortunate to have a truly stellar panel with us. First of all, we have the Honorable Stefan Löfven, who is the chair of the SIPRI governing board. Before that, he was, of course, the Prime Minister of Sweden from 2014 to 2021. And even before that, he was the leader of the Social Democratic Party from 2012 all the way to 2021. But perhaps more germane to the purposes of this discussion, he was appointed by the UN Secretary General to co-lead this high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism in preparation for the 2024 Summit of the Future. Welcome, Mr. Löfven.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We also have Elizabeth Spehar, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. She has over 35 years of experience in international and political affairs. She has worked in UN headquarters, but also in the field, leading political development, peace building, and conflict prevention initiatives. But her real claim to fame is having been my predecessor running the OAS political shop, the Organization of American States. It's wonderful to have you here, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Kevin.
And finally, but we're very fortunate to have Ms. Fatima Gailani, who is a prominent Afghan political leader and a leading voice for Afghan women's rights. She played a crucial role in the efforts to negotiate a peace agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and from 2005 all the way to 2016, she was the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society. She was recognized as one of BBC's 100 Women in 2021. It's great to have you here, Ms. Gailani.
Thank you.
So, we'll get on with this. Just to note that there's translation to Russian in the background to the benefit of our Belarusian friends. So don't get distracted by it. It will be in the background, but we'll get on with a wonderful discussion up here. So let me start with Prime Minister Löfven. You co-led the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, and a report came out. So on the basis of all that work and all the discussions that preceded the launch of the report, what is effective multilateralism? And what, in your view, are the most important recommendations made in this report with regards to advancing peace and security in today's fractured world?
Yeah, thank you for that question. First, to avoid too high expectations, there were several processes ongoing to prepare for the Summit of the Future. So we were one of them. There's the Global Digital Compact. There's a new agenda for peace and so on. But what we meant with, and I co-led with the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So that was an honor in itself to work with her. When we talk about effective multilateralism, we came up with 10 principles. I won't go through all of them. I'll give you a few examples. Multilateralism need to be people-centered, so that people understand this is for us. This is for the benefit of us, and I will come back to a few examples of that. It must be equitable, because we have a huge problem with too much inequity in the world, and that in itself creates problems and conflicts. So we have to think equitable. Fourth is representative, so that people feel they are represented, and that the decision-making bodies are representative, so that people understand this is handled in a good way. And a fourth is resourced. We need a lot of investments around in the world, not least in the developing countries. So we must make sure that we are resourced for this. Those are 4 examples of principles. The most important proposals. Well, we landed in what we call 6 transformative shifts, because this is not just a little step. We need to do something radical. So 6 transformative shifts. The first one is rebuilding trust in the multilateral system, and example of that is including youth in a much better way than we do now. We have a youth office coming up, or perhaps already in place, and we support that, but we can do more. Another is gender, and we are very blunt, saying that we will not achieve anything of this. We will not achieve this unless we make sure that we have a gender equality work in multilateralism. So we have so much to do. Example, go back to Beijing platform, make sure we act from that, make sure that nations also, when they're budgeting, when they propose a state budget, that they do that with a gender equity perspective. The second is people and planet, and what we say there is phase out the fossils. We need to do that, be very clear. And another very concrete example of this is that we have 800 million people around the world that do not have electricity to their households. Let's start making sure that they have that. It's a huge project, huge investment, but think about it, if we can do that, and we can. We don't lack resources. Third is global financing. We think that the global financial architecture needs to have another mandate, clearer to meet the needs that we have, and also more resources. So you have to shift the way of thinking risks, so that you can bring in more private capital, and there are other proposals as well. When it comes to digital and data, it may not sound so exciting. We propose, among other things, a commission on just and sustainable digitalization. What do we mean by this? We need to have an overall global view on the digitalization, not least data. Data is an asset that will become more and more precious, so we must make sure that we move away from this, again, on equity distribution of data. The fifth is peace and security, and there we propose phasing out of nuclear weapons until 2045. If we do that until 2045, we've had a dangerous century, a quite stupid century with nuclear weapons. Phase it out until 2045. I know that will be, many don't think that is possible, but we need to put it on the agenda because right now we think, rightly so, and we say rightly so, that the climate need to be fixed before we need to change enough until 2030 to get this done with the climate. This is a threat that we have right now. We're sitting right now. Every breath we take, every minute we live, every hour, every day, we have the threat of nuclear weapons. So let's face that out. And we talk about common security. We can build common security instead of threatening one another. Let me just say we have mutual assured destruction is the term. Mutual assured, listen to that, isn't that stupid? We can assure one another that we can destroy one another. Is that security? No. MAD, mad. Let's change that into mutual assured survival. That is totally different. I think we should shift that narrative. Last, anticipatory action. We need to see things before they try to see as much as possible before. Climate change, we know, is also a part of the security issue. So, 6 transformative shifts, concrete proposals, and built on these 10 principles.
Thank you. Let me go over to Elizabeth. Can you tell us a little bit about the practical steps that the UN system is taking and will be taking to strengthen the peacebuilding architecture as part of the effort to increase the effectiveness of multilateralism?
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. And first of all, I have to say that the report of the High-Level Advisory Board has been really a welcome set of inputs for what we are trying to grapple with currently at the UN and beyond. The Secretary General has been very clear that we are facing, as I understand was discussed at length yesterday at this forum, the world is facing a series of very deep and multiple and interlocking and overlapping crises and threats. And there is definitely a sense that the world, as we know it right now, is not fit for purpose, nor is the multilateral system per se fit for purpose for the times that we are facing. And the HLAB, because we love to reduce everything in the UN to acronyms, the HLAB report has been excellent in sort of pointing us into some very important directions that should be considered by member states and indeed by people all around the world. In terms of what we're doing specifically in the framework of the peacebuilding architecture, let me mention a few things quickly that we're already doing and what we hope to do more of in the future. So first of all, what we call the UN peacebuilding architecture, it's usually identified as the Peacebuilding Commission, which is an intergovernmental commission that has been set up to support countries that are on a peace-building journey, that are trying to build and consolidate peace in their countries. We have the Peacebuilding Support Office, which I head in the Secretariat in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and then we have the Peacebuilding Fund of the Secretary General, which funds peacebuilding initiatives. The high-level report mentioned the Peacebuilding Commission, and as a body that should be strengthened, and this is something I think that has already been picked up. We have a very dynamic leadership of the PBC right now, the permanent representative of Croatia, and he is working with the membership of that commission to make it more relevant, more concretely supportive of member states that need the support of the PBC. They're trying to work on providing more concrete and useful advice to the Security Council when it is considering certain countries or themes on its agenda, and it's also broadening its outreach to a wider constituency. More of that, I'm hoping can be done in future, because quite simply this is the only intergovernmental body in the UN that is tasked specifically with contributing to build and sustain peace, and it could be a key prevention and peace-building platform in future, much more complementary to the Security Council and other mechanisms, and much more relevant in the peace and security architecture if we really pick that up. So I think that will be happening. Secondly, I would say within the peace-building architecture, which is, by the way, actually broader than what I described, it's the whole system within the UN, there is a big focus on inclusion. And I think we've been making strides. Again, we need to do more as we go forward, but there has been a real effort within the Peacebuilding Commission and within what we support through the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund to make sure that we are putting important resources towards empowering women, getting them front and center as decision makers, supporting that process, and youth as well, which Stefan mentioned. We've seen through many different studies that exclusion is one of the key ingredients in so many places that lead to conflict. So we have to make that inclusion is the order of the day. Thirdly, we've been focusing on partnerships. I think the key thing in terms of building and sustaining peace is that neither a single country, given these global threats we're facing, nor a single actor can do it alone. And certainly the UN has its tools, but it needs to work with others. So working more with regional, sub-regional organizations, working more certainly with civil society, the key, a key along with national authorities, bringing in the private sector for peace building, and international financial institutions. They also have a role to play. Two other things we're trying to do in the peace building architecture to move the needle is to focus much more on results and impact. We need to be able to show what we are doing and financing, supporting, politically or otherwise, what that has changed. Has it actually changed something perceptibly on the ground? That's important for those who support us, either financially or otherwise, but it's important also to the people that we're pretending to serve. So that's very important. We're going to put more energy into that. And finally, financing, which Stefan mentioned. There was last year in the General Assembly a resolution that was passed on financing for peace building, where unanimously the countries confirmed there is a big peace building funding gap. We know that only 12% of ODA in fragile contexts goes to peace, and we know that military expenditures around the world have now gone well over 2 trillion. If you look at what's being put into peace in terms of resources and what is being spent in other ways, it is glaring, the difference. Thank you.
Stefan was mentioning that multilateralism, if it's to be effective, needs to be people-centered. And all these things are perceived in a different way from the ground. So, in light of the Afghan experience, Fatima, what needs to change and what do you need from international actors such as the UN to advance your work to develop peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable societies?
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel. First of all, I'm extremely happy that the UN, from our perspective, is doing what we expect the UN to do, a home for everybody, and accommodate those expectations that exist in countries like Afghanistan from the UN. If a problem can be solved internally, that would be easier and it will be practical and sustainable. But in the problems that we had in Afghanistan, which the problem was not an internal problem, initially it was an international problem. The country 45 years ago was invaded by one of the superpowers, so that immediately took the whole thing out of Afghanistan. The players were outsiders. Afghanistan became the ground or of rivalries, regionally, internationally. Every kind of rivalry that you can think of was fighting in the grounds of Afghanistan. That's made it a hill of a life for the last 40-odd years. Today, it is an opportunity again. As difficult as we look at it regarding the education of women, which is absolutely disastrous. If you see, from my perspective, a woman who was the president of one of the most important parts of Afghanistan, which was the Afghan Red Crescent Society, playing a very important role in the lives of people, today a woman cannot even work. All this is very difficult. So if we leave it for Afghanistan itself, it cannot be solved, because Afghanistan, unfortunately, cannot have even food for the next day unless it is an influence from outside and the work of the UN and the donor countries. So the same thing goes with the politics of Afghanistan. If the problem of Afghanistan is left just for the region, it is impossible that there aren't designs that the region wants to take out of Afghanistan, whatever it is. So it is only logical that it is left to the hand of every country in the world, which makes it the UN. They have the expertise, they have the means, and they have the access to the country to do it. But it is important that they will have the region on board, but most importantly, listening to the people inside Afghanistan. That what is exactly do they want? We don't want to be recipient of aid for the rest of our lives. We want to, Afghanistan is potentially a very rich country. We want to be able to survive of our own. But the situation that we are now, it was not an internal problem, it was an external problem. And I think we are looking forward to the new approach of the UN to come and help us to solve it.
Thank you. This is very interesting because you mentioned the role that geopolitical rivalries played in making life hell for Afghan people over the past half a century. So I'll go with you, Stefan. Those geopolitical conflicts have never gone away, and we've added a few new ones. So how do we ensure that geopolitical tensions do not stand in the way of addressing growing challenges to our collective security?
I think that leaders must admit to themselves and to the people that the best way going forward as a nation is with the international cooperation. That we do need to solve things together. We can't do this alone. We can't hand over to a single country to handle the climate change or pandemics or peace or whatever it is. This needs to be done together. And I think today that we have too much of nationalism and sometimes also regionalism, although I believe that regions can be a very important part of the toolbox, so to speak. So, but now it's like it's only here we can see. But we know at the end of the day that we have to work with others to get this fixed, and we know that if for example, if the richer part of the world cannot support the poorer part of the world in the green transition, well, the pollution will still ongoing, and it will hurt us as well. So we have to. I think that narrative is very important. That this cooperation, multilateral cooperation, is a win-win. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. So if we invest, if we cooperate, it'll be better. Leaders can turn to their voters, to their citizens, and say, "Hey, this cooperation is good. For me, look what I've done." So that you can feel proud that you have actually done something at the international arena. I think that is not the only answer, but I think it's an important ingredient.
No doubt. Elizabeth, it's great that we now have this report and that we have the work that the high-level advisory board has done. Some of the recommendations and some of the elements of the diagnosis we have known for a long time. So the thing is, what happens next? I mean, now that we have this report, this set of recommendations, how do we bring about the transformation that the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism is recommending?
Right. Well, I think there are a number of ingredients that we need, and perhaps the most obvious one is political will, right? I mean, we have the multilateral system that member states want. Things work or they don't work because there is either the commitment to doing it or there is not the commitment to doing it. So this is the first key thing with respect to where we need to go. In the report of the high-level advisory board, and also you'll see quite a few things reflected from the high-level advisory board's report in different manners within the upcoming new agenda for peace. There is a kind of a golden thread through these reports, and the new agenda for peace in particular will establish the point that there are three really key ingredients that we need to consider when moving forward. One you mentioned, Stefan, trust, rebuilding trust. Another one is universality, and another one is solidarity. And so if I just go quickly over those three, rebuilding trust is critical. And when we look at the deepening distrust among regions and member states and the geopolitical tensions that have really gone through the roof lately, if I may say, this is an untenable situation. Now, we're not going to be Pollyannish about it. It's not as if one expects that countries will just hold hands and cooperate and sing kumbaya, as they say, and agree on every issue. I mean, competition, geopolitical competition, trade competition, so on and so forth, it's a natural part of the system of the world of nations. We understand that. But the point is that, as again Stefan was saying, there are these even existential really issues that we're confronting now that truly is a huge problem for all of us. And there's no way we are going to be overcoming those if we are not finding some ways to cooperate. In order to do so, we have to rebuild a minimum amount of trust. In terms of universality, again, the idea is that these things are affecting all of us, and we need to understand that we're all in it together. And a very interesting point that will come out, I believe, in the new agenda for peace will be the trying to get the concept of the universality of prevention to be accepted. In other words, every country has its vulnerabilities. Every country is confronting these threats. Every country needs to invest in preventing. And then the solidarity principle is that, again, we will not get out of these very serious situations unless we really have solidarity among states. We are, one of the things the new agenda for peace will be really focusing on, based on these principles, is that we need to get member states to recommit to the foundational values and principles of the United Nations. In other words, there are rules of the road of how countries should behave towards one another. There are also tools that need to be recommitted to. There is a whole chapter on the Pacific settlement of disputes, which, if they were used more consistently and if they were strengthened, would again prevent and avoid a lot of the problems that we have now. So we need member states to do that. And this could lead us to transformational change. Thank you.
I'll go with Fatima now. Fatima, you made a very strong case about the need for the UN to be present in a place like Afghanistan, doing essential work. The thing is that we know that in many cases it's not fit for purpose. You know, it falls short in terms of many of the things it does. It falls short in terms of the expectations of some of the people that are on the ground. So when you read this report, what do you think of this report? What do you think of the proposals? Are they ambitious enough to make sure that the UN and multilateral organizations are able to perform the duties that they should be performing in a place like Afghanistan?
Before I answer this, I want to re-emphasize what you both said, which is building trust. If you don't trust anyone who is coming and trying to fix something for you, it will not work, especially in a country like Afghanistan with several languages, ethnicities, sects in Islam and all that. You need to see that player, that international player, to be really neutral. That each part of Afghanistan will see that neutral. Then the promises which were made in Afghanistan over and over again for the last nearly 45 years, it was breaking those trust and promises that made us to be the situation we are, because at the beginning we were trusting. If someone came and said that we come to help you to build a new Afghanistan, we believed it. But when I saw that the whole world was so blind or pretending to be blind to this horrible, fantastic corruption in the country, which was the cause of the collapse, that was shocking for me. That should not happen again. And this, if I want to relax and breathe and say that breath, take a new breath and say, this time it will happen, then what the promises made, what is in this paper, should be implemented and should be taken serious by the UN itself and the important countries who are backing the UN financially or even politically. The expectation of people of Afghanistan from UN, from all the countries that they are helping us, is one thing. Please don't make it a double standard when you come to countries like Afghanistan. What you expect from yourself, expect it from me. If you think that you deserve it, we deserve it also. And then constant talks and engagement is part of the work. With the present government of Afghanistan, if we talk about today's Afghanistan, but also with civil society, with people who matter in Afghanistan. So this is that don't have a double standard and stick to the promises that you make.
Thank you. I'll shift gears here, and I'll go.
Can I just add something on that, please?
Yeah, please. By all means.
Because I think we're discussing a core issue here, and that is trust.
Yeah.
So I first want to acknowledge my panel colleagues and their statements. The richer part of the world, the developed world, as we call it, or North or West or whatever we call it, need to show for real that we are changing our way of acting, changing our way of thinking. That is the first moment where we can start rebuilding trust. And that means, example, we promised already 2009 that we will add $100 billion to the climate transition, supporting the developing world. That hasn't been delivered yet. 13 years later, 14 years later, it hasn't been delivered. No wonder that the global south mistrust the north. I would have done that. So, and I mean, 100 billion is actually, if you look at the world resources altogether, that's a small amount of money. It's a lot of money, but if you look at the whole, it's nothing. It's peanuts actually. So it's a shame, in my view. We need to say also that the investment that we have ahead of us is we're not talking billions anymore. We're talking trillions, trillions of investment. I think we have a gap to meet the SDG goals. I think there's something $4 to $7 trillion will act. We can do that as well. And the moment we do this, to show, not talk, to show, and walk the walk, then we walk the talk, then we can start building trust. And that is crucial. If we don't do this, we will be stuck where we are. Start building trust, start acting, and those most responsible countries, member states, are the richer.
Not to speak of the fact that far more than $100 billion have been spent rescuing a few banks and bankers in the meantime, right? So let me shift gears here, and here's a question for both Stefan and Elizabeth, and it's a slightly thorny one. If we talk about effective multilateralism, I have to think that one of the most difficult issues that we have is this terrible dissonance between the way our institutional architecture to govern the international system is designed and the realities of power out there. And speaking about trust, I can tell you from where I can see that it is that dissonance that generates a lot of mistrust in the so-called global south. And I was telling Stefan just before the panel that a few days ago, really, when you read Foreign Minister's Lavrov's speech in Brazil, and the way he frames the conflict in Ukraine, he speaks to that point. He frames the conflict in terms of this dissonance. And there's an audience for that kind of stuff in a place like Brazil. So my question is, how do we close the gap in this terrible dissonance that is generating so much resentment beyond the West? Is the West, for lack of a better term, willing to lead the process to close the gap and to reform the institutional architecture, the institutional structures of governance at the international level?
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
Well, I like the way you phrased it at the end. Will the West be willing to lead such a process? I think that might be the problem from the get-go. I think there is some definite fatigue out there about this perception that the West is always leading, and what is the legitimacy for the West leading, right? I talked earlier about this issue of recommitting to the foundational values and principles of the United Nations, of our charter, which is such a rich starting point to try to address many of the problems, in many ways all of the problems, if properly applied, that we're looking at presently. But there are sometimes these voices that, well, these are actually Western concepts. We were colonies when this was decided. We might have a different approach, and so on and so forth. There is this sort of deepening skepticism as to who's really calling the shots and whether that's still legitimate. So I don't think it's a question of the West or any one particular bloc leading. It's how we can, in a way, level the playing field in terms of global governance. And that is a very thorny one. So, I mean, the elephant in the room would be a reform of the Security Council, of course.
For example.
And this is something that the high-level advisory board did address in its report. It's something that we all know has been debated for decades. whether there will be changes, whether there are changes afoot or not. I think there's not a great deal of optimism with respect to that. But there are ideas that could perhaps move forward about improving the working methods and having the General Assembly perhaps take on a role when the Council cannot in terms of peace and security. There are a lot of ideas out there, and this is and will be in the purview of member states, not of myself, not of the Secretariat, not of the H-Lab or many others. But certainly these things are being more and more looked at. The Secretary General, it's no revelation, but he has talked a lot about also the unevenness or maybe the even unfairness of the international financial architecture and how that should change. So there are these transformational ideas, potentially transformational ideas that could perhaps redress the balances, but this will be for the member states to debate and to see how they're going to go forward. But certainly there is definitely out there this very clear message from many countries that the old ways of doing business are not fit for purpose. Thank you.
Stefan, but before I give you the floor, I mentioned the West because, in a way, this international architecture has been designed by the West, and the West has been controlling that architecture, and that's what generates the resentment. So it reminds me, you know my part of the world rather well, Elizabeth. And it reminds me that old quip from President Kennedy back in the day about social change in Latin America, saying that those that make gradual change impossible make violent change inevitable. Mm-hmm. Is the same sort of thing applied to the global space, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why I mentioned the West. I don't think that I'm not particularly interested in the West calling the shots in the reform process, but it is the West that needs to let go a little bit of the privilege that it has enjoyed all this time. Stefan.
No, first it's a very relevant question because I think a big part of the problem lies exactly here, the one that you described. We think that representation is very important, and that is why we also suggest the changes of the Security Council, not concrete changes, because there are ongoing discussions right now. Whether they will lead up to anything, we don't know. But we hear there's a discussion, and we thought it would be wrong for us to come up with a detail, that country, that country, that country. So we didn't do that, but we point at the fact that there's a misrepresentation, huge country. India surpassed China, I believe, when it comes to population. India is not in the Security Council. An African continent is also the continent that will grow substantially in the future in terms of population, is not a member of the so we point at a few things. We also point at regions as being one of the tools that we can use. You get closer to the reality if you use the regions, but it has to be in coordination with the global perspective, so that we don't develop regions into something that is just by their own, so to speak. We have to gather under the UN flag, and then also use regions as an important tools, and not least the global financial architecture. We propose, first we ask ourselves, why is it that the head of World Bank must be an American?
I don't understand.
Why is it that the head of the IMF must be a European? Why is it that the poor countries, the developing countries, are so unfairly represented in the governing bodies, in the decision-making bodies? We have to change that, and that is also a way of building trust. So those are a few examples, I think, that we can change that narrative.
Great. Fatima, you mentioned, and I think Stefan also just did actually, the role of regional bodies. Let's unpack that a little bit. In the case of Afghanistan, what role have regional bodies played? What role could they play? And in what kind of relationship with the UN?
Well, it is not just in Afghanistan. In many countries, region and neighbors, as much as they are part of creating problems, they are part of solving problems. And Afghanistan is not an exception. And it is nothing hidden that in Afghanistan, our neighbors didn't play always a very positive role. First of all, at that time, Soviet Union was a neighbor, and what they did to Afghanistan, I mean, till today we are suffering from it, and it goes the same way with other neighbors. But if we want to find a solution for Afghanistan, even if it is under the most perfect situation that the new orders will come to the UN, but still their role will be extremely important. And their role will be in bringing peace to Afghanistan, rebuilding Afghanistan, make it easy. Afghanistan is landlocked country. Any of our neighbors could just say that you can't use our borders to bring anything inside Afghanistan or exporting. Then our life is in danger, our livelihood is in danger, everything. So they have a very positive role. But if this role is left only to them, it will not end at anything but rivalry. But if it is orderly under a bigger picture of the world trying to solve an Afghan problem, then their role could be very positive.
Elizabeth, you mentioned the question of political will as a key variable in this story to reform multilateralism. But you also mentioned that, and rightly so, that there are a lot of people that are wary of, having any particular group of countries lead this process. So then the question emerges, what kind of leadership is needed to bring about those changes that are needed, and where should it come from?
Yeah, no, I mean, very good question, Kevin. I think when we talk about leadership, we often think about political leaders. We often think about men, default. I think we have historically, we think of certain profiles of men. And the truth is that if it was ever fit for purpose to have that type of quite narrow leadership model, which I would question from the outset, I think it definitely is not fit for purpose for today and the challenges that we're facing, right? So in terms of leadership, and one can look at it at the multilateral level and also at the national and subnational levels, I think that's very important. What are the kinds of things that we need? I think we need bold leadership. Because if we're really to translate the idea that we have to be preventive, we have to try to avert the worst from happening, we have to be active, we have to be ready to move quickly and not just be reactive. We need leadership that can be decisive and bold and act early. Leaders need to be effective. One of the problems in terms of leadership in many countries is that people do not feel that their leaders, that the systems are actually delivering for them. If leaders cannot deliver, then if they're not effective in that sense, then they are not going to be seen as legitimate. And leaders need to be also legitimate. We need also leaders with integrity. So that there is transparency and they are leading with really their basis being key values and principles. And they also need to be accountable. And I think accountability was something that the report also underscored a lot. It's not a free ride. Leaders have to be held accountable. And in terms of where do we find such leaders, I think we can find them in many places. You can find them in the smallest villages. You find them in civil society organizations. You can find them in the private sector. And of course, we need to find them in the political sphere as well, very much. And we need to have a more diverse leadership. And I mentioned that point at the beginning. We definitely need to have gender equality when it comes to leadership. How on earth can we have over half of the world's population that are women, and yet still leading in so many minute spaces still? Look at our parliaments around the world. Look at so many other bodies. Look at the multilateral institutions. We're getting much better, but there's still a ways to go. And there's a big push for having more youth voices in leadership. And I think that's critical, because they are in the now, but they also are definitely in the future. We need to engage them more. So we need to be looking in different places for leadership, but above all, we need those leaders to have those certain very key qualities.
Great. Stefan, one of the shifts that the report mentions concerns the digital transition. And, well, there are many aspects to this digital transition, but a pretty glaring one is what's happening with artificial intelligence. One would think that given what's happening right in front of our eyes, there's an overwhelming case there for collective action at the international level to regulate and, quite frankly, to prevent some of the pretty harrowing consequences that can come out of the progress with artificial intelligence. Was this issue part of the deliberations within the high-level advisory group? Do you get a sense that there's appetite and willingness and viability for this kind of global action with regards to artificial intelligence?
Regarding appetite, I think, first of this, I think Elizabeth knows more, but I would say yes and no. There is an awareness that this is becoming more and more acute, that we have to deal with it and that we have to find a common solution. On the other hand, there is also the case that countries and enterprises see this as a competitive advantage of being at the very forefront. That's constantly competing, is that we're number one and we're number one, and not really sure where that will end up. Yes, we discussed that as well, and one example is connected to weapons, not least nuclear weapons, or also other weapons, that we cannot end up in a situation where we have nuclear weapons or others, these hypersonic weapons, and the decision is made by artificial intelligence. We have to stick to an order where decisions must be made by human beings. And that is one of the perspectives, and that we have to find a common view on the limits and of course the possibilities with AI. But we once again, this is a global good. It's a common global good that we so we have to handle it globally. So yes, we touched upon it. It wasn't a huge issue. We also had this, as you know, the working in parallel with us, the Global Digital Compact. So we made sure that we cover the data piece, that the access to data is so important for everybody, a fair access to data, and also the privacy and the risk for private people with this. So we took out those pieces of the subject.
Great. My final question goes to Fatima, and it's about an issue that both you and Elizabeth have mentioned, and it's for sure one of the key questions, which is the role of women in bringing about a different kind of multilateralism. If you were given a magic wand to do one thing to make sure that women get their fair share in the new multilateral system, what would that be?
Well, it is not that easy. Especially, it's not that easy in our part of the world. I had a very small stake in my hand when I was a commissioner in the Constitution of 2004 in Afghanistan. And I can challenge that Constitution regarding the participation of women was one of the best, and still is one of the best in our region. And that Constitution really had nothing against Islam. On the contrary, some of the articles were precisely with the teaching of Islam. It is not really changing the situation for women with a wand. It is really the willingness to do it. There is nothing in my religion against the involvement of women, whether it is in politics, whether it is in war, in peace, in work, business, or anything. On the contrary, it is very encouraged. What I am scared and what is harming us is a very old tradition and tribal system which is mingled and sometimes is imposed in the name of our religion. So this takes time. It is impossible that you will just try to change it overnight. It needs a long-term talk and change the situation which is sustainable. We did change the situation 20-odd years ago, and we thought it was sustainable, but it was other factors which brought us back to square one. But there are things that they cannot wait for tomorrow, and one is education. Education for girls and boys, we cannot wait for tomorrow. Today we have to provide education for women. If it cannot be in schools because there are problems happening in Afghanistan, digital. Let's do it. If girl cannot go to school, let's take education to their homes. This is one thing that the world, Afghans, non-Afghans, should not wait for tomorrow. Yes, we have to work, we have to convince, we have to negotiate, we have to be engaged, but we have to find parallel ways when it comes to education for children of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Very valid point. Well, I think this has been a wonderful discussion. We've talked about trust, about inclusion, about solidarity, and I'll end the panel making reference to something that Elizabeth said, which is that we really need to go back to the foundational documents of the UN, because there's a lot there. I mean, despite everything, those documents are our best hope. More so now than in 1945. So I think we all agree that a renewed commitment to international cooperation is needed to tackle the challenges of the kind of fractured world that we have around us. And I really hope that this discussion will open up new lines of debate on solutions, on practical steps, on recommendations that may be put forward to increase both the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the multilateral system, that we continue this discussion and that the implementation of all these reforms truly advances and bears fruit. So, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and let me ask the audience to give a warm round of applause to our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.